Stephen Griffiths. It's a cool night in Bradford, England, on June 22nd, 2009. It's a Monday. Most people are winding down from their first day back at work. They only want to go out if they really need something. Otherwise, they want to stay bundled inside with their family. And Susan Rushworth was no different. She had just moved back in with her mother and was using the opportunity to spend quality time with her. She had struggled the last 10 or 15 years of her life, following a brain hemorrhage that caused epilepsy. Susan fell into a severe drug addiction, and to fund that, she began a life as an intimate worker on the streets of Bradford. But in early June, she began to turn her life around. She was a mother of 3 and a grandmother, even though she was only 43. In all that time, she knew that she had a life beyond the streets, just waiting for her. For 5 weeks, she had been 100% sober from her drug of choice. This is when she moved back in with her mom and felt hope for the first time in a while. Not just hope, but a sense of normalcy. She could feel a more stable, secure, and safe way of living. And so on June 22nd, she was one of those people who were having a relaxed night in. But tonight, she also really needed something. I don't know the specifics, but Susan needed medicine of some sort. Thinking she'd be gone for only an hour or 2, she hopped on the bus and started towards the pharmacy. And at some point along the way, she ran into Stephen Griffiths. Stephen was born not far outside of Bradford, in a city called Dewsbury. By this point, though, he resided in Bradford as he went to university there. He was enrolled in a master's program in criminology. He seemed like a normal, intelligent, and friendly guy. And when he met Susan, he told her that he was an aspiring photographer, that he was inspired by her, and actually wanted to photograph her. He was creating a series of pictures of women lying on his bed with their backside up in the air. These would supposedly go up in an art gallery exhibit. I feel like a lot of people would be creeped out, or at least cautious, by this offer, but he was pursuing his masters. He seemed smart, charming, and very ambitious. And for Susan, the idea seemed interesting and maybe even a door for her, an opportunity that could offer her a new life. If this Stephen guy was who he said he was, and in a way, he was a student, and in a way, he was kind of a photographer, but it's not what he said. It's what he didn't say. What Susan didn't know is that Stephen came from a very troubled childhood. There's actually not a lot of information other than that when he was very young, he had a habit of watching his mother have intimacy with many different men in their garden. Yeah, doesn't really point to having a happy adolescence. Neither does the fact that when he was 17, he attempted to shoplift at a local supermarket. When he was caught, he cut the cashier's face with a knife, then added more to his record years later when he held a knife to a girl's throat. For what? I'm not sure. But he was convicted and jailed for both. And when he was in prison, he confessed to having a fascination with serial killers. Not just that, but also a dream of following down that path. Yeah. He really did say that out loud. He let everyone know that was his goal in life, to become a murderer. So that begs the question, is he studying criminology to work in criminal justice, or to better understand the mind of the people who commit the crimes? And on top of that, and more importantly, is it just pictures he wants of Susan? Well, like in any good horror movie, this can only be described as a scene where you yell at the TV screen and beg for the main character to not open the door, the one we all know the killer is behind. No matter how much we want Susan to go get her medicine, get back on the bus, and go back to her mother, that's unfortunately not what happens. She ends up in Stephen's apartment, and it's there that Stephen tries his hand at what he's been infatuated with for so long. He murders her with a crossbow for some reason. Then, to make it more vile and disgusting, he dismembered her and ate some of those parts that he removed. The evidence for this came from traces of blood that were later found in Stephen's apartment. But it would be a while until that was discovered, and Susan's body was tragically never found. And without that evidence, it would be another year before Stephen was outed as the monster that he is. And it would be another year until he struck again. On April 26th, 2010, he lured Shelley Armitage into his apartment, using the photographer excuse like he did the last time. Like Susan, Shelley also struggled with addiction. But soon before the 26th, she had gotten a puppy, who she was obsessed with. She loved the puppy, and it was something that she would slowly change in her life for. But while she thought she would only be leaving the dog for a couple of hours that night, the two never got to be together again. Shelley fell into the same fate as Susan, except this time, Stephen wanted to document his work. After murdering her, again with a crossbow, he filmed and narrated the process of dismembering her. And if you thought it couldn't get any more sickening, he also spray painted on her back, "My S slave," all while saying, "I am the Ven pariah. I am the bloodbath artist. Here's a model who is assisting me." It's blood boiling that these innocent women, both full of potential, had to meet this disgusting creature. Someone that killed them in such a disgusting way that no one but himself should endure. But people like that never stop. And on May 21st, 2010, he went prowling the streets for another person to trick back into his apartment. This time, it was Susan Blamires. Yet again, a woman who was out on the streets after a couple hard years and a struggle with addiction. At this point, it's obvious that Stephen has a pattern, and it's not a coincidence. He's finding women who are in vulnerable positions. They all have extremely difficult lives and don't feel like they have many options to create better for themselves. And all of them were intimate workers at this point, which means they find themselves in sketchy situations often. But more often than not, those times worked out fine. In a way, they were kind of used to creepy men. While it may not have seemed like Stephen was the nicest guy, he seemed like the rest of them. A little weird, but not a murderer. And like the rest of them, Stephen tried to take advantage of Suzanne. But unlike everyone else, she didn't fully buy into what he was selling. Maybe at first she did, but at some point on the way up to his apartment, she had a gut feeling she needed to leave. But it wasn't that simple. She tried to leave, peacefully at first. But when that clearly wasn't an option, she made a run for it. And Stephen was right behind her. Now the two of them were in the hallway. Suzanne was going as fast as she could, all the while praying that she could find a way out of this nightmare. But Stephen was faster and bigger, and when he tackled her, that was it. He shot his crossbow and Suzanne was gone. As he dragged her back to his apartment, he realized something that would change everything. A security camera was in the corner, watching everything, capturing the evil that is Stephen Griffiths. But this security camera wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random security measure for the apartment building, because when he was convicted for his previous violent crimes, all of his talk of wanting to become a serial killer did worry law enforcement. For the 2 years leading up to the murders, the police kept a close eye on him. They had actually taken away hunting guns that he owned, but when he was noticed to be reading books on dismemberment, they also contacted the housing association where he lived. This is when there were higher quality CCTV cameras installed near Stephen's apartment. If it weren't for that, who knows when Stephen's killing spree would have ended. 3 days after Suzanne was murdered, an employee of where Stephen lived found the security tapes. It's horrible that an innocent man had to view the horrors of what Stephen was capable of. But thankfully, to his bravery and willingness to talk to the police, Stephen Griffiths was finally caught. On December 21st, 2010, he was convicted of all 3 crimes and sentenced to life. During all of that, in court, he gave himself the nickname Crossbow Cannibal. What's behind that persona, though, is just a sick and disgusting man. While relieving and uplifting that some justice was finally served for these victims and their families, what's chilling is that there may be more to his past than these 3 women. When he was arrested, he confessed to killing a total of 5 intimate workers, which means there's 2 unaccounted for. One of these is possibly a woman named Rebecca Hall. Her body was found only 870 yards from Stephen's apartment, and she wasn't a stranger to him. He actually had her over often. Police had many reasons to believe that the murder was connected to Stephen, but he was completely quiet when he was questioned, and that's how he's remained. Although he admitted to the 5 killings, he won't talk to the police anymore on pretty much anything. So what we know is pretty much all we know. For now, unless Stephen decides to open his mouth, other information or victims are completely lost to us and law enforcement, the same way that all the footage of the murders of Shelley and Suzanne are. The videos and photos he took of Shelley were found on a phone he left on a train, and it did get circulated around when it was sold twice, but whoever ended up with it that second time gave it over to the police, and that's where it's remained since. The CCTV footage of Suzanne has been partially released. NBC News broadcasted some footage of him flipping off the camera after he discovered it was there, as well as him chasing her down the hall. But all film and pictures of the actual event are not available. But honestly, I can't say it's something I'd want released. Stephen Griffiths is an evil man, and the things he did to those women are revolting. It turns my stomach to even imagine it. Like the apartment building employee, it would be traumatizing for most to watch. It's not something the public needs to see. Stephen will rot away the rest of his life in a jail cell, and all proof of what he did to Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne will also rot away with the police, or better yet, destroyed forever. Daniel P. Dukes. Thousands of killer whales reside in the waters of Iceland. Today, they get to freely roam the North Atlantic Ocean, living peaceful lives in their families, otherwise known as pods. But this wasn't always life for an Icelandic orca. From 1975 to 1989, there were about 64 whales captured for the purpose of being placed in aquariums all over the world. You probably know one of them, Keiko from the movie Free Willy. He was taken in 1979, but he was actually released back into his natural habitat in 2002. But some whales didn't quite get that level of stardom, or the happy ending that plays at the end of Free Willy. Meet Tilikum. Tilikum was captured in 1983 at the age of 2 years old. What was an average day turned into a nightmare. Most likely either hunting, socializing, or playing, he was living his normal, everyday whale life, until all of a sudden, his world exploded. Boats came speeding around him and his family, chasing them into shallow coves, and as they were quite literally being cornered, the peaceful and natural sounds of the ocean suddenly turned into chaos. The people above him were sending explosives into his home to disorient Tilikum and his family. And it was Tilikum they were after. Young calves were often targeted in these captures, and he was no exception. And while orcas are extremely intelligent creatures, the violent nature of this kidnapping was not something they could fight. Tilikum was taken. His mother chased the boat for miles and miles, exhausting herself, all the while crying out for her baby, crying until she couldn't anymore. But the boat kept going and going until eventually Tilikum couldn't hear his mom anymore. He spent about a year at an aquarium in Iceland until being moved to Sealand of the Pacific in British Columbia. Here he was forced to perform tricks in exchange for frozen fish. All the while, he was being kept in an extremely small tank with 2 other female orcas. None of the whales had the adequate space they needed, which led to tension in the enclosure. Tilikum's roommates were just as miserable with the situation and took out their anger on him, harassing him all night. He was often seen with thousands of open cuts all over his body. Luckily, this torture for him only lasted a year, until he was moved to a somewhat better living situation. He was sent to SeaWorld in Orlando in 1992, where he would be a breeder. But like I said, this was only a somewhat better situation. Here, he didn't have other orcas bullying him all day, but it still wasn't the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't even close. In his natural habitat, he would dive up to 1,000 feet and sometimes travel 140 miles a day. At SeaWorld, his tank was at most 34 feet in depth. For comparison, a bowling lane is 60 feet. That's right, a bowling ball can travel more than an orca whale. It's outrageous. And while Tilikum may have done his job as a breeder, fathering 21 calves, he was in hell. All of his natural instincts and needs were suppressed. He was thousands of miles away from his family and spent most of his time isolated. He was miserable. But on July 6th, 1999, there was one man that wanted to try and change that, become friends with Tilikum, maybe even have his own magical Free Willy experience. This man was Daniel P. Dukes. Daniel was from South Carolina, and how he ended up in Orlando isn't really known. He was sort of a drifter, moving from place to place. He lived on the outskirts of society, actually residing at a Hare Krishna temple at the time. Though a Hindu place of worship, it's hard to say what kind of life he led exactly, as he had been in jail a week before July 6th, apparently for stealing a candy bar. Although, what's more questionable are his decisions the night he met Tilikum. At some point in the night, he managed to sneak through all of SeaWorld security and into the pool where Tilikum was. What happened next is hard to say, but at 7:20 a.m., when Michael Doherty, a physical therapist who worked at the park, arrived for the day, he noticed something. Something so horrific, he almost didn't even want to look. But he had to. And when he did, he found Daniel on top of Tilikum. This wasn't a joyride though. He was laying, unclothed, and stiff as a board. Michael described him as in rigor mortis when he was discovered, so dead. Once Daniel was examined by a coroner, it became clear that he sustained many injuries before and after his death. The autopsy is long and I won't go into all of it, but Tilikum really messed him up. So much so that an employee who was witness to this aftermath said, "The body that I observed had no clothes and I could not be identified if the body was male or female. And keep in mind, Daniel was completely unclothed. So it's no mystery how he died. Obviously, his bright idea of going for a swim with a wild animal who's now in captivity was not the smartest. But what I and many other people don't understand is, how did Daniel even manage to get in there? SeaWorld is a huge operation, a company that employs people overnight for the specific purpose of watching the orcas 24/7. This was done to prevent exactly what happened with Daniel. Yet somehow, this guy managed to get around all surveillance tapes and security just to take a swim. I mean, I know the guy is good at stealing candy bars, but this feels a little bit different. But it's impossible to know how he got in, because SeaWorld says that they have no security camera footage at all. Now, orcas can't smell, but I can. And I can smell that bullshit from a mile away. There's no way on this planet that one of the largest aquariums that's holding a 12,000-pound killer whale doesn't have a camera watching the tank. If that was the case, they're absolute idiots, because apparently the security themselves couldn't actually, keep the park secure, unless of course that part of their story is also made up. It's speculated that Daniel was found earlier than 7:20 a.m., and if so, that he was found alive. Why would they lie about that? Well, because they're clearly the ones to blame for all of this. Like, obviously, Daniel shouldn't have gotten in the tank with Tilikum, but he was just some random guy with no knowledge of orcas. And I know I've mentioned Free Willy a million times, but it may have played a part. At the time, the public image of orcas was that they were friendly animals that saved boys from drowning. This may have been the experience Daniel was seeking out. Sure, some more thought into what he was doing would have probably saved his life, but an even better precaution would be a security guard, or a gate, or anything that kept him out of the park completely. And as for Tilikum, by 1999, he had been captive in his tank for 7 years. 7 years of forced breeding, performing for screaming crowds, and swimming in circles. Tilikum, among other orcas, are not naturally aggressive animals. Any violence that he exhibited was from the frustration that had been building since the moment a literal bomb dropped in the ocean and exploded his life. But honestly, he may not have even come at Daniel with aggression. He may have been bored. Orcas are naturally very playful, and the amount of stimulation that SeaWorld gave him wasn't even close to what he needed. He may have seen Daniel as his toy, unaware that his version of playing was actually dangerous for someone so small in comparison. Tilikum is not a murderer, it's a wild animal. Despite all of this, SeaWorld paints the story in such a way to fault anyone but themselves, especially by making Daniel out to be an unstable pothead who went in with bad intentions. There was even a marine mammal trainer, Rick O'Barry, who made clear his beliefs on the whole thing, making it clear that Daniel was not malicious, but probably fascinated by Tilikum. And Tilikum wasn't a villain himself. Quote, "I think the whale probably pulled Daniel down, held him underwater. I don't think they know how often we breathe. The problem is that the whales have nothing better to do. They're bored. We literally bore them to death. It's like you living in the bathroom for your life." I don't think anyone could have said it better. But despite the backlash, even from marine animal experts, SeaWorld never takes accountability. In fact, 11 years later, a trainer died while handling Tilikum. Dawn Branchow had been working with him during a live show in the park when he grabbed her and pulled her into the water, causing her to drown and also endure blunt force trauma that led to her death. But still, even with all the acting out and the obvious turmoil that poor Tilikum was in, he was forced to return to performing a year later. And that's how he remained living until his days until 2016, when he unfortunately died due to a bacterial infection. What's tragic about his death is that now he had no chance of escaping his tank and going back home. But no matter how heartbreaking it is, SeaWorld still holds orcas captive for the purpose of entertainment. And at the same time that they suffer in their tanks, any possible footage of Daniel P. Duke's death remains lost. Although there are confirmed pictures of his body being carried around by the whale, taken by park employees for reference. However, the photographs and the surveillance footage, if it exists, have yet to surface, as these are more than likely being held by the FBI, never to be given out for an official release. The footage could probably show us how he got into the park, or his first interaction with Tilikum. Was he pulled into the water like Dawn? Or did he get in himself? Did he call for help? Did anyone notice him fighting for his life? But as long as the company or the FBI keeps it hidden, we will never really know what happened on the night of July 6th, 1999. Danielle LaRue. It's the mid-80s in Kamloops, British Columbia, a city so rich with scenery and beautiful landscapes, it's easily a hub for outdoor activities. Residents and visitors spend the days mountain biking, hiking, skiing, or whatever other adventure they can find. It's a place bubbling with excitement, energy, joy, but not everyone is living this picture-perfect life. And for two foster children who just recently moved back to Kamloops, Norman Jr. and Kim LaRue couldn't be further away from all of that. The two children were born from a line of hereditary chiefs of the Neskonlith Native American Band, located in the Shuswap district in Kamloops. Their father, Norman Sr., was where that hereditary line ended, because his election as chief was overturned due to voting irregularities. That reasoning seems vague, and while I can't find any more information on it, the details of Norman's life may have played a part. He was born on a reservation and ended up being sent to a Native American residential school, a boarding school designed to integrate Native American children into European/Canadian culture. If it sounds wrong, it's because it is. And not surprisingly, a lot of abuse occurred at these schools. Abuse that was no stranger to Norman. And even worse for him, it didn't stop when he went home. He was a victim of it at home, as well as neglect. At a very young age, he was binge drinking with his father, blacking out with a parent who was supposed to be raising and protecting him. This cycle didn't stop as Norman grew older and had children of his own. His drinking got worse and progressed to full-blown alcoholism. When he could manage to stay sober, he was amazing to be around. He was smart, charming, and ambitious. But once a drop of booze entered his system, he became violent, aggressive, and dangerous. This quickly spiraled into severe abuse towards his wife and children. All of the rage he was feeling was taken out on them. His wife and mother to Kim and Norman Jr. was no stranger to addiction either. But having had enough of this miserable life the LaRues were in, she sobered up and actually became an addictions counselor. But it was too late for the children. In the mid-80s, they were placed into foster care. They jumped around from home to home for a bit, but eventually landed with a family in northern British Columbia. A lot of the foster homes that the kids ended up in were not great. and usually pretty bad. But this one in particular was awful, to say the least. Two poor young kids were terrified. But Kim and Norman weren't alone in this. Enter Danielle LaRue. Danielle was the oldest sibling of the three, and she didn't take this position lightly. Her nickname was Holy Smoke, given because of how fearless she was. A spitfire, not afraid to say or do anything, especially when it came to Kim and Norman. She was willing to do whatever she needed to protect them. When the kids were all put into foster homes, Kim and Norman stayed together and Danielle was separated. But she knew that her sister and brother were in trouble, and the distance between them meant nothing to her. At the young age of only 10, she managed to find her way and sneak into the home they were staying at. She took her siblings and kept them with her, where she knew they were safe. Some may call this kidnapping, like the police, I'm sure, but it was also an act of bravery and love. Eventually, with pressure and force from police, Danielle gave up her siblings back to the foster family. Her fight was strong though, and it shows how much her siblings meant to her. But there was only so much she could have done. Eventually, she had to escape the abuse she was under in her own foster care. After her father was convicted of a murder in 1989, Danielle was on the streets, barely a teenager. She managed to survive out there as an intimate worker. Emphasis on barely. Life was beyond hard this way. Haunted by her past and tormented by the present, Danielle had to find ways to cope with how much pain she was in. Following the footsteps of addiction that Norman Sr. had placed before her, Danielle turned to drugs. It's tragic and heartbreaking, but not hard to imagine why she felt this was her last resort. The only way out of the hell she was living in. Kim, who also eventually followed this same trajectory, describes that experience in a way I think Danielle would have agreed with, and why she couldn't escape it. Quote, "As soon as you take these drugs, you don't feel that stuff anymore. It makes everything okay. It makes everything good. That's something that's hard to walk away from." And Danielle wouldn't deal with it. She didn't want therapy. She didn't want rehab. She always said, "I have time to straighten my life out later." But for Danielle, there was no later. Any opportunity to create a better life was passing her by. Instead of moving forward in any way, she only spiraled more and more downwards. Eventually, this led her to the downtown east side in Vancouver. Kim says, "Everybody knew that once you went to the downtown east side, you were done. You were either going to be dead or in jail. Those were the only exits you had. It's like a big black pit with stabbings and ODs. It's crazy down there. Nobody cares about anybody but themselves and their next fix." Well, Danielle managed to survive for a while, but Kim's bleak illustration of the east side was not wrong. Someone can only last there for so long. At some point, you have to get out. And if you don't escape into jail, well, there's only one other way out. And when the police reported Danielle missing on May 12th, 2003, that's the first explanation that comes to mind. But the police don't jump to any conclusions, or if they do, they share very little about it at the daily press conference that day. All they say is that someone anonymous has reported her missing. She hasn't been seen since November of 2002, and any information would be greatly appreciated. It's so vague and cryptic that no media outlets even cover the story, except for one article published on May 20th, 2003, titled "What's Missing Here is Justice" by Daphne Bramham in the Vancouver Sun. The journalist criticized Vancouver law enforcement for not announcing the case until 6 months after the fact. Her anger was completely justified. Danielle's disappearance got entirely swept under the rug. And that's how it stayed for another 4 years. Finally, It was brought back into the light in 2007 when reporter John Daly wrote about Danielle for Global BC in an article that covered a broader case on unsolved murders and disappearances of intimate workers in British Columbia. John included a section on Danielle and one detail that would change everything. What the police failed to mention in 2003 was that they had received an anonymous letter on New Year's Eve in 2002. Whoever this person is writes, "To police, I sent message about this to Vancouver police a few days after incident, but have seen nothing in news about it. Am guessing they either didn't receive it or can't match info to victim. So here is letter again, with additional information. This is about Vancouver intimate worker who disappeared at the end of November 2002. Don't remember name she gave me. Had no ID. Sounded like she had just recently come to Vancouver. Caucasian, long, black, curly hair, jeans, black leather jacket, tattoos, and jewelry. She is dead." Then a couple lines of redacted information, but after that is some more writing that they kept public. "I send this info so you can notify her family. If you can, please make mention of her name in Vancouver Sun. I would like to know who she was." And again, they redacted another paragraph, but they let us see the last section of the letter. "To her family, I am more sorry for this than you can imagine. I did not intend this, but am still responsible. Wish I could take it back, but can't. She will not be unmourned. Have brought flowers to her grave once already. Plan to do so every year as am able. Not ideal, but better than no visits at all. I know you can't forgive me, but please believe I tried my very best to bring her back." John Daly says in his story that the police have reason to believe that the woman this writer talks about is Danielle. What's unclear to me is whether the author of the letter is the same person who tipped the cops off about her disappearance, or if they're two separate people. The letter was sent on New Year's Eve, but the cops didn't announce her missing until May the following year. It doesn't make sense, and it feels like there has to be more information, because the description of her in the letter doesn't seem like it automatically points to Danielle, or really proves anything. The whole thing would probably make more sense if law enforcement gave the public literally any more information. Something that wasn't as vague and mysterious as what they've offered us so far. But no, all it seems they've done is give a very loose timeline of the disappearance, announce it 6 months later, and then not even mention the letter that they believe is from the last person who saw her. And on top of that, they've hid half of the letter. Plus, where is the first letter that this person wrote? They said, "I sent message about this to Vancouver police a few days after incident, but I've seen nothing in news about it." Even this guy is shocked that they seem to not care in the slightest about this girl. Maybe some of the redacted information is graphic and too sensitive. Maybe Danielle's family didn't want it released, which is something I can live with, but otherwise, this is a missing persons case, and giving the residents of Vancouver all information that they have may help, find her, or at least find closure for the family. But we'll never know why those couple of paragraphs have been removed, or if it would be useful in finding Danielle. All we can see is that the info that's been released hasn't gotten anyone very far. On the website VP Cold Cases, a website the Vancouver police made for unsolved crimes, there's a case still open for Danielle. It was last updated on August 22nd, 2016, 14 years after her disappearance. 14 years of heartbreak for Norman Jr. and Kim LaRue. But Kim doesn't hold out much hope. She knows the devastating outcome for most people that are as deep in addiction as Danielle was, and thinks that's ultimately where she ended up. Quote, "I can't say that anything could have saved her. When you're abused to the extent that she was, I don't think anything could have helped. It's tragic that someone as brave and loving as Danielle had to endure such a brutal life with a cruel end. But the resilience that she did have, and the love for her siblings, lived on in Kim. Despite her certainty that no one makes it out of the downtown east side, that's exactly what she did. When given a ticket out of British Columbia, she took it and never looked back. She got a stable job and created a plan to go to university and study law. I don't know if Kim believes this, but I'd like to imagine that Danielle is content watching her sister beat the system and cycle of abuse that held them both hostage for years. And hopefully one day, Kim can get some real closure and justice for her older sister. And we are still just left wondering, what was blanked out from that letter? Did anyone have access to the original letter? Why wasn't it publicized? And why was it hidden for months before finally being announced? And hopefully we get the letter uncensored one day, but from the looks of it, it doesn't seem like we will ever see the fully uncensored letter.